Is this some kind of joke? The voice, sharp and laced with the condescending bite of youthful arrogance, cut through the humid afternoon air. Kyle Kramer, lead technician, 26 years old and top of his class, kicked the landing skid of the dormant helicopter. The thud of his boot against the olive-drab metal was a flat, unsatisfying sound. The machine, a relic from a bygone era, sat defiant and silent on the otherwise pristine tarmac of Fort Holloway. Around it, a team of a dozen technicians in crisp coveralls stood with their arms crossed, their faces a mixture of frustration and embarrassment. Laptops with diagnostic software lay open on portable tables, their screens filled with green-lit system checks that all screamed the same lie: everything was fine. Yet the UH-1 Huey, affectionately nicknamed the Patriot Bell, refused to start. Its rotor blades drooped in the heat like wilted leaves. A few yards away, an old man stood alone, his presence a quiet rebuke to the frantic energy of the technicians. He was thin, with a cloud of white hair and skin weathered by decades of sun and wind. He wore simple denim jeans and a faded olive-green jacket, the kind that had gone out of style before most of the people on the tarmac were born. He just watched, his hands tucked into his pockets, his gaze fixed not on the bustling technicians, but on the helicopter itself, as if listening for a secret it refused to share with anyone else. Lieutenant Wells, the officer overseeing the fiasco, strode over to the old man. His jaw was tight, his posture rigid with the authority of his fresh-out-of-officer school rank. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, the word sir a formality stripped of all respect. "This is a restricted area." The old man's eyes, a pale, clear blue, shifted from the helicopter to the lieutenant. They were calm, observant, and held a depth that made Wells feel strangely transparent. "General Michelson sent for me," the old man said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "The name's Eli Vance." Kramer overheard and sauntered over, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "Vance, you're the guy the general pulled out of retirement. We've got a dozen certified avionics specialists here, 3 master mechanics, and a direct line to the manufacturer's engineering department. What exactly do you think you're going to do?" Eli's gaze drifted back to the Huey. "Just look for now." "Look," Kramer scoffed, throwing his rag onto a toolbox. "We've been looking for 6 hours. The digital multimeter shows perfect continuity. The fuel lines are clear. The ignition system is getting power. Every sensor is online. The computer says it should fly. It's this old bucket of bolts. It probably just decided to die." A few of the younger technicians snickered. The contempt was thick enough to taste. They saw a fossil, brought in to consult on a fossil. A publicity stunt, maybe, or a general's moment of sentimental madness. This was a day for cutting-edge diagnostics and precision engineering, not for old men and their hazy memories. Lieutenant Wells crossed his arms, mirroring Kramer's impatience. Mr. Vance, we appreciate you coming down, but as you can see, we have the situation under control. My team is highly trained. They're trained on glass cockpits and fly-by-wire systems," Eli said, his voice even. "This bird is different. She has a soul. And right now, her soul is quiet." Kramer let out a short, incredulous laugh. "A soul? Okay, Pop. You hear that, guys? We don't need a spectrum analyzer. We need an exorcist." The laughter from the crew was louder this time. Eli ignored them. He began a slow walk around the helicopter, his movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. He didn't touch anything. Not yet. He just looked. He peered at the rotor mast, his eyes tracing lines no one else could see. He bent down to examine the tail boom, his expression unreadable. The technicians watched him with a kind of fascinated disdain, as if observing a curious ritual from a primitive tribe. "His credentials," Wells muttered to Kramer, looking at a file on his tablet. "Says here he was a crew chief in Vietnam." He said the word Vietnam as if it were ancient history, a chapter from a textbook. "A crew chief," Kramer repeated, shaking his head. "So he knows how to patch bullet holes and swap out parts in a jungle." "We're not in a jungle, Lieutenant. We're on a modern military base with tools that cost more than his house." Eli stopped near the portside engine cowling. He was looking at a specific panel, a small, almost unnoticeable plate just below the main exhaust. He squinted, his head cocked. "What is it?" Wells asked, his tone heavy with theatrical patience. "See a ghost?" "Something like that," Eli murmured. He pointed a steady, wrinkled finger. "That access panel. Is it flush?" Kramer rolled his eyes and walked over, running his hand over the spot. "It's flush. The torque specs on those bolts are perfect. I checked them myself. The sensors behind it are all green." "Did you open it?" Eli asked. "There's no reason to open it," Kramer shot back, his frustration boiling over. The diagnostics show no fault in that subsystem. Opening it would mean breaking a factory seal and generating a mountain of paperwork for a non-existent problem. He gestured expansively at his array of computers. The system tells us where the problem is, and it's not there. Your system, Eli said softly, doesn't know this bird. I do. He reached into his old jacket and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. It was scarred and stained, the leather softened by decades of use. The snap was polished smooth from the touch of his thumb. He fumbled with it for a moment, his old fingers not as nimble as they once were. Kramer smirked. What's in there, Grandpa? A magic wand? Eli didn't answer. He simply looked down at the pouch in his hands, and for a fleeting second, the noisy tarmac of Fort Holloway dissolved. The air was thick, wet, and smelled of rot and cordite. The deafening whump 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 of rotor blades battered his ears. He was 20 years old again, his knuckles bloody, sweat stinging his eyes. Tracers, green and terrifying, zipped through the triple canopy jungle below. Inside the vibrating belly of this very same Huey, a pilot was screaming on the radio, a co-pilot was slumped over the controls, and a half-dozen grunts were praying. A round had punched through the engine cowling, and the bird was losing power. He'd crawled out onto the skid, the wind trying to tear him away, and from that very leather pouch he'd pulled a roll of sealing tape and a stubby, custom-ground wrench. The pouch had been a gift from a pilot he'd saved the week before, a man who swore Eli could raise aircraft from the dead. He had braced himself against the fuselage and worked, his hands sure and steady while the world fell apart around him. The memory vanished as quickly as it came, leaving the ghost of rotor wash in his ears. He looked up, his pale blue eyes refocused on the arrogant faces of Kramer and Lieutenant Wells. They saw an old man with a shabby tool bag. He saw the ghosts of the young men he'd kept alive. The heat was becoming oppressive. The general's demonstration flight was supposed to have started an hour ago, with dignitaries waiting in a cooled viewing stand across the base. The delay was turning from a technical issue into a full-blown embarrassment. Lieutenant Wells's radio crackled. It was the base commander, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Status report, Lieutenant." "No change, Colonel," Wells said, struggling to keep his own voice steady. "We're still troubleshooting a no-start condition. The techs are running level 3 diagnostics now." "And the civilian?" "The one General Michelson insisted upon." Wells glanced at Eli, who was still standing quietly by the engine. "He's here, sir. He's observing." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Put him on the phone with the general. Now." The order felt like a slap. Humiliated, Wells walked over to a young airman who was part of the support crew, a kid named Peterson. Peterson had been watching the entire exchange, not with the derision of the technicians, but with a quiet, troubled curiosity. He'd seen the way the old man looked at the helicopter, the way he carried himself. It wasn't arrogance, it was a profound, unshakable familiarity. "Peterson," Wells snapped, "the colonel wants the civilian on a secure line to General Michelson." "Yes, sir," Peterson said, grabbing a tactical phone. But as he approached Eli, he saw the looks from Kramer and the others. He saw the dismissal in their eyes. And he remembered his own grandfather, a quiet man who had fixed tanks in the Ardennes and never spoke of it. Something clicked in his mind. This wasn't right. He handed the phone to Eli, but then on impulse he stepped away and used his own personal cell phone. He scrolled through his contacts and found the number for the general's direct aide, a major he'd met during a briefing a month prior. It was a long shot, a massive breach of protocol, but his gut screamed at him to do it. The major answered on the second ring, his voice harried. "Major Davies." "Sir, this is Airman Peterson at the flight line at Fort Holloway," he said, his voice low and urgent, turning his back to the others. "I'm sorry to call you directly, but sir, it's about Mr. Vance." "What about him?" the major asked, his tone immediately sharpening. "Is he all right?" "He's fine, sir, but the situation here is not good. The lead tech and the lieutenant in charge, they're treating him like he's senile. They're laughing at him. They won't let him near the aircraft. They're relying on their computers. And sir, I don't think the computers know what's wrong. This man, Mr. Vance, he looks like he does." There was a dead silence on the other end of the line. For a moment, Peterson was certain he was going to be court-martialed. Then he heard muffled shouting, the sound of a chair scraping back violently, and the major's voice now directed away from the phone. "General, you need to hear this." Now, inside the air-conditioned command center miles away, General Michelson, a man with 3 stars on his collar and a face carved from granite, took the phone from his aide. He listened for 10 seconds as Airman Peterson quickly relayed the scene of casual disrespect on the tarmac. The general's face, already stern, hardened into something terrifying. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words were cold, precise, and carried the weight of his entire career. "Major," he said, his voice a low growl that made everyone in the room flinch. "Get me Colonel Hayes on the line. Conference him with the tower at Holloway. Now," he looked at his aide, "and get me a car. I'm going down there myself." He muted his end of the call and turned to the assembled staff in the command center. "For those of you who don't know," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "the man my officer and lead technician are currently humiliating on that flight line is Elias Vance. In the Washoe Valley, in 1968, he kept 60% of the 1st Cavalry Division's Hueys in the air using scavenged parts, baling wire, and sheer force of will. They didn't call him a crew chief, they called him the Ghost because he could make dead birds fly again. The Patriot Belle isn't just a Huey, it was his Huey. He was her crew chief for over 1,000 combat flight hours, a flight that earned him a Distinguished Service Cross when he landed on a hot LZ under fire to rescue a pinned-down LRRP team after both of his pilots were wounded." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the silent room. "The reason that helicopter is so special, the reason it's the centerpiece of our heritage fleet, is because of a modification he personally engineered in a mud-soaked tent, a modification that is not in any manual. Now someone get me that car." Back on the sun-baked tarmac, the tension had reached its peak. Eli Vance had finished his call with the general, a brief exchange of quiet, respectful murmurs that the others couldn't hear. He handed the phone back to Peterson with a small, grateful nod. Then he turned back to the helicopter. Kramer, emboldened by the lack of any immediate lightning strike from the heavens, stepped in front of him. "Okay, you've had your phone call with your old war buddy. We're done here. The colonel wants this machine moved to a hangar." "I can get it started," Eli said simply. "Just let me open that panel." Lieutenant Wells had reached his limit. His authority was being challenged by a relic in front of his entire team. His career flashed before his eyes. A career stalled by a stubborn old man and a stubborn old machine. He made a decision, a disastrously poor one. "That's enough," Wells said, his voice dangerously loud. "Mr. Vance, you are a civilian interfering with a military operation on a secure installation. I am ordering you to leave the flight line immediately." Eli didn't move. He just held the lieutenant's gaze. "I mean it," Wells said, taking a step forward until he was invading Eli's personal space. He lowered his voice to a threatening hiss. "One more word, and I will have you escorted to the base stockade for a full security review. Do you understand me, old man?" He placed his hand firmly on Eli's shoulder, intending to physically turn him and march him away. It was the final, irrevocable overreach, the ultimate act of arrogant folly. The sound that cut through the air wasn't the sputtering of an engine, but the high-pitched squeal of tires. A procession of 3 black command vehicles screeched to a halt on the tarmac just yards away, their doors flying open before they had fully stopped. From the lead vehicle emerged General Michelson himself, his face a mask of cold fury. Following him was the base commander, Colonel Hayes, whose face was pale with dread. The assembled technicians froze, their mouths agape. Lieutenant Wells snatched his hand back from Eli's shoulder as if he'd been burned. His blood ran cold. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him. General Michelson didn't run. He moved with a speed and purpose that was far more terrifying. He strode across the concrete, his eyes locked on Eli Vance, ignoring everyone else as if they were nothing more than inanimate scenery. He bypassed the stunned lieutenant and the petrified lead technician, coming to a halt directly in front of the old man in the faded jacket. In the ringing silence, General Michelson, a 3-star general in command of the entire region, brought his heels together with an audible crack. He raised his hand to his brow and delivered the sharpest, most respectful salute of his long and decorated career. "Mr. Vance," the general said, his voice booming across the tarmac, clear and strong for all to hear. "It is an honor to have you on my base, sir. I apologize for the reception you've received." Eli simply nodded, a flicker of sad understanding in his pale blue eyes. He did not seem surprised or even particularly vindicated. He just seemed weary. The general dropped his salute but remained at attention. He turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over the dumbstruck crowd of technicians and falling with laser-like intensity on Lieutenant Wells and Kyle Kramer. "Let me make something perfectly clear to all of you," the general announced, his voice dropping to a lethally quiet register that nonetheless carried to every corner of the flight line. "This man, whom you have treated with such profound disrespect, is a living legend of Army aviation. This is Elias the Ghost Vance. He holds the Distinguished Service Cross for Valor, 2 silver stars and a bronze star with a V device. He has more combat flight hours as a crew chief than every single pilot on this base combined." He pointed a rigid finger at the silent helicopter. "That aircraft, The Patriot Bell is not just a piece of equipment, it is a monument. In 1969, during a monsoon, Mr. Vance personally field-stripped and rebuilt her transmission in less than 12 hours to rescue a downed recon team. In 1970, he redesigned the fuel flow regulators on this specific bird, a modification that is not and never will be in any of your manuals or your computers, a modification that allowed this Huey to fly higher and carry more weight than any other in the fleet. A modification that saved the lives of my entire platoon when he flew in to pull us off a hilltop we were about to be overrun on. I was a scared second lieutenant then, and he was the calmest man I have ever seen. A wave of shock rippled through the crowd. Jaws were slack. The technicians, who moments before had been snickering, now looked at Eli with a mixture of awe and deep burning shame. Kramer looked as though he might be sick. Lieutenant Wells's face had gone from pale to ashen. He was staring at the ground, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The old man wasn't just a forgotten veteran, he was a giant, and they had been trying to swat him like a fly. The general turned his full attention back to Wells and Kramer. His voice was now barely a whisper, yet it was more terrifying than any shout. Your arrogance, your blind faith in your technology, and your utter lack of humility and respect have disgraced your uniforms in this command. You had the one man on this planet who knows this aircraft's every secret standing right here offering his help, and you threatened him. He stepped closer to the lieutenant. You put your hand on him. It wasn't a question, it was a verdict. General, a quiet voice interjected. It was Eli. He had stepped forward, placing a gentle, calming hand on the general's rigid forearm. They're good men, just from a different time. They trust their screens. It's not their fault. The bird just needs a familiar touch, that's all. His grace was more cutting than any reprimand. He was defending the very men who had humiliated him. In that moment, he wasn't just a hero from the past. He was a teacher, offering a quiet lesson in wisdom and forgiveness. The general held his stare on Wells for a moment longer, then gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. He stepped back, ceding the stage. She's all yours, Ghost. Eli walked to the side of the Huey and finally unfastened the snap on his worn leather pouch. He didn't pull out a diagnostic tool or a complex meter. He retrieved a single, oddly shaped wrench. It was dark, forged from some unknown metal, and curved at an angle that matched no standard tool. As his fingers closed around it, the world flickered again. He was in a sweltering makeshift hangar at Quezon, the air thick with the smell of canvas and hot metal. He was grinding this very piece of steel on a whetstone, shaping it by hand, checking its fit against a custom bolt he had machined himself. It was for his modification, the one no one else knew about, the key to the secret heart of the machine. The bolt controlled a manual bypass for the primary fuel injector, something he'd designed for emergencies, something no computer would ever know to look for. Back in the present, he reached for the small access panel that Kramer had dismissed. With the custom wrench, he turned the 4 bolts. They came loose with a smooth ease that no standard tool could have managed. He removed the plate, revealing a small, simple lever nestled within a tangle of wires. It was switched to the standard position. With the tip of the wrench, he gently nudged it to the bypass position. It clicked softly into place. He replaced the panel, tightening the bolts with a practiced touch. He then walked to the cockpit door and looked at the stunned technicians. "Someone want to try her now?" he asked, his voice calm. As if in a trance, Kramer stumbled forward. He climbed into the pilot's seat, his hands shaking slightly. He went through the startup sequence, his fingers flying across the controls from muscle memory. But this time, when he hit the ignition switch, the result was different. There was a cough, a sputter, and then, with a thunderous roar that shook the very air, the turbine engine of the Patriot Bell screamed to life. The long, drooping rotor blades began to turn, slowly at first, then faster and faster, until they were a shimmering, invisible disk, beating the air into submission with the familiar, life-affirming whump 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 that was the heartbeat of a generation. The effect on the crowd was instantaneous. A spontaneous cheer erupted. Airman Peterson, the young man who had made the call, had tears in his eyes. The technicians were clapping, their earlier arrogance replaced by pure, unadulterated awe. Eli Vance simply stood back, a small, sad smile on his face, watching the bird he loved come back to life. In the days that followed, the fallout was swift but quiet. General Michelson didn't court-martial Lieutenant Wells or fire Kyle Kramer. Instead, he instituted a new mandatory training program for all maintenance personnel across his command, the Heritage Program. It focused on the history of their service branch's most iconic equipment, told through the stories of the men and women who flew, fought, and fixed them. The first module was about the UH-1 Huey, and its star was a grainy photograph of a young crew chief named Elias Vance. A week later, Kramer and a humbled Lieutenant Wells found Eli at a small roadside diner a few miles from the base. He was sitting in a booth by the window, nursing a cup of coffee. They hesitated at the door, then walked over, their hats in their hands. "Mr. Vance?" Wells said, his voice barely a whisper. Eli looked up and nodded. "Lieutenant, Mr. Kramer." "Sir," Kramer began, his voice thick with emotion. We came to apologize. What we did, how we treated you, there's no excuse. We were arrogant, and we were wrong. We are so sorry." Eli looked at their faces, at the genuine remorse in their eyes. He gestured to the empty seat in the booth. "Sit down," he said, his voice gentle. "Let me buy you boys a cup of coffee. And maybe, if you've got the time, I'll tell you a story or two about that old bird." They sat, and as the afternoon sun streamed through the diner window, the old hero began to speak, bridging the gap between generations with stories of courage, ingenuity, and the quiet, unassuming valor of the forgotten. We hope you were moved by the story of Elias Vance. These tales of quiet heroism deserve to be heard. If you agree, please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more stories that honor our heroes.